Hey folks, David Stewart here. I just wanted to say a quick bit about anti-heroes and villains, and even sympathetic villains. Maybe we'd call them anti-villains. This is a little bit in response to a video I made a couple nights ago about American Beauty and English Patient, where people ended up assuming that I didn't like anti-heroes or didn't like stories about evil characters like, Godfather, Scarface, or IPs like Berserk were mentioned. And the truth is, I actually really like anti-heroes. In fact, one of my favorite characters is Elric from Michael Moorcock's Elric series, a very classic anti-hero. I liked the Vampire Chronicles stuff in my youth. So I've always liked anti-heroes, and I like Godfather Part 1 and Part 2, not so much Part 3. So I've always liked anti-heroes, but I could see why people would think that maybe I don't because of some of the things I said about the characters in those other two movies, in American Beauty and English Patient. Namely that I said that they were doing bad things, or they were bad people. And I kind of meant that a little bit in that Nietzschean sense, like good versus bad and good versus evil, that master-slave morality dynamic, where I view these characters and their actions as contemptible and petty and not in any way interesting or virtuous. Whereas an anti-hero, I think, is something very different. I don't think the characters in English Patient are anti-heroes, even remotely. Anti-hero is usually a hero that doesn't have all the normal qualities of a hero. Like, he's not good necessarily. He might do bad things. He might have something about him that's weird. He might be an alcoholic or something. But usually people think of the anti-hero as like it's from the bad guy's perspective, and I don't think that that's quite true. If you go and you let's look at Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 is a great example of this this sometimes fluidity between an anti-hero and a villain and what really makes them work. We have a really cool character named Vito Corleone. And he's an anti-hero, I think, in that first movie in a great way. And the reason he's an anti-hero is we're introduced to him. Has a very powerful presence. Marlon Brando did a great job with that performance. He has a strong presence. He's very calm, and we understand he's very powerful in those opening scenes where somebody's asking him for a favor, and we see him sort of manipulating the scenes as things go on. We see a virtue to him, and that virtue is patience, understanding, planning. We get that he's sort of a mastermind of this criminal organization, and it's very interesting to kind of watch him at play, and we kind of root for him to succeed. And the reason we really root for him to succeed is who is played against the anti-hero. Vito Corleone's his opponents are not the good guys, right? It's not a bunch of nuns, right? It's not like the reincarnation of Jesus. It's other bad guys. It's other criminal families. It's drug dealers. It's corrupt cops. None of the people in Godfather, none of the central characters in Godfather are good. They're all somewhere in that evil category. They do bad things. However, Vito Corleone also has his own set of ethical standards. He's like a lawful evil, if you want to put it in like RPG terms. There's a scene where they're having a meeting with all the families, and he says, I don't want drugs being sold to white kids. You can keep it with the blacks. And now we may see that and be like, oh, that's not virtuous. That's his own weird little ethics that he's sort of asserting, that he has some sort of ethical standard about what kind of business his criminal family is going to be getting into. And he didn't like drugs. He thought drugs were kind of dirty, that like gambling was better. And if you have drugs and you're giving them to white kids, you're doing something specifically worse and bad to the community versus gambling, which he viewed as like, providing a service in a sense. So you have an interesting set of things, and the people on the other side are in a lot of cases worse, and we're very sympathetic towards Vito because of his character and his strong virtues that are exhibited to us, and his like loyalty to his family. And it's very important, that opening scene, we see him being both powerful and kind, and that comes into play later throughout the movie as we start to really kind of pull apart who he is and get to really see him act. At the same time, you have his son Michael, and he has an arc from a real sort of neutral and good character to an evil character in that movie, and that's continued in the second movie. So he steps across a threshold and he kills this corrupt cop. We don't want the corrupt cop to live. We want the corrupt cop to die because he's corrupt. We don't care about him. So the anti-hero is not acting against a good guy. He's really acting against another bad guy, but maybe a bad guy that we like worse, we think is worse because he's part of this drug dealer ring. There's lots of unsympathetic characters in the drug dealer enemy camp in Godfather. And then he becomes kind of an anti-hero where he's doing these sort of objectionable things, but we want him to do those. And he comes back and he takes over the family and he orchestrates like the cleaning of house. And that's an interesting moment because it's like a satisfying execution of evil in a sense. And that continues in the second film. In the second film, you see the cycle completely come close. That's what Godfather 2 is about, because you have these we have Robert De Niro playing young Vito, and he comes to America and he does all these things that are there to protect himself and to further, his community and whatever he's going to do. He's kind of applying his ethics even then, although he's doing all these bad things, but he's doing things that he thinks are necessary. And at the end of it, he essentially has become a wicked person. And we see the same thing with Michael. Michael's picking up where he left off in the first movie and is completely becoming depraved towards the end, to a point where we understand that he actually kills his own brother. And at the end, his wife basically tells him that she aborted his child, thus letting you know that like he's become so depraved, like he can't even command the loyalty of those he once loved, and that this person, his wife, loved who he was and has now seen what he's become, and it's something awful. That he's crossed the line from an anti-hero, a sympathetic anti-hero, and become a true villain by committing some of his heinous acts. So it's a very interesting closing of the circle that we have with those two. And Francis Ford Coppola does an excellent job playing this gradation between, villains that we have some sympathy for, all the way to true villains, like anti-heroes to true villains. At the same time, you can also have a character that's like a really sympathetic antagonist or a really sympathetic villain. And I think a really good example would be Tommy Lee Jones in The Fugitive. Tommy Lee Jones is the cop in The Fugitive, right? And he's trying to catch Harrison Ford's character, I don't remember the character names right now, but he's trying to catch Harrison Ford's character, and we don't really want him to, because we want Harrison Ford's character to succeed. The main conflict and the plot goal is for Harrison Ford to clear his name. Tommy Lee Jones, we don't dislike him. He's a good guy. He's highly sympathetic. He's trying to do his job. He's trying to maintain law and order, all things that we think are virtuous and right and good. But he is opposed to the actual protagonist, and the actual protagonist has to kind of act outside the law. He has to, he has to fake IDs and do all these other different sort of illegal things to stay out of jail in order to clear his name. This kind of a means versus ends thing, and where those things are going to lie. So, really, Tommy Lee Jones is kind of an anti-hero. He's a really sympathetic villain. He's not evil. He's just set against the protagonist. And I think that that's an interesting element in lots of different stories. You contrast all this with the way that characters are in The English Patient, and they don't really exhibit any specific virtues. When people just sort of decide to cheat on their spouse for no reason, and like that's sort of the centerpiece of the story, you end up having contempt for that because you don't see any of the virtues of what the person really has. And I don't remember the name of the main character in English Patient, but I just remember him doing a bunch of things that didn't show any kind of strength or virtue. Something cool about reading Elric is like Elric is really powerful, and sometimes he, there's a part in like Fortress of the Pearl at the end where he unleashes Stormbringer, his like demon blade, and just kills all his enemies in this one town, just wipes out all of this noble class, and it's really satisfying. Even though it's like he just murdered a bunch of people, it's like, yeah, but they caused all these problems, and they're wicked and they're evil, and just kill him. And that's what makes an anti-hero, is who's he setting against is somebody that we really tend to not like him. But anyway, that's sort of what I think about that. So leave me your comments down below. Tell me about some of your favorite anti-heroes, or maybe highly sympathetic villains, or protagonists that don't fit that normal mode of good guy, and tell me what drew you to them and made them highly sympathetic, what made them interesting to you and made you maybe root for their goals, because it's you're going to find, I think, in these stories, there's lots of different variations for how that works. But I think the main thing is you see some sort of strength, or you see something redemptive or virtuous or interesting or whatever that, or you have like an anti-hero that's set against something that's worse. So you end up really viewing the wrath of the anti-hero as something good and cool and interesting. One last one I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this actually, but the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. You have this anti-hero of Lestat. He's really not a good guy. He's a vampire. He kills people like every single night, right? That should be bad. But because he's a vampire and there's something bound up in his nature or spirit to do these things, we tend to just find his being more interesting than impressing upon him judgment for his actions. It's like, he's a vampire. That's what vampires do. You know, we kind of tend to let that go as the audience, and kind of focus on what makes the character interesting, because that's something that's part of their I guess ingrained being, is that they have to do that. So that's the last one I'll mention, but you give me yours down below. I really do appreciate the conversations and all the comments on the last few videos, particularly about Hollywood, and I hope you guys will leave me more and give me some info about what made you think that an anti-hero was a cool character in something that you read or something that you saw. And with that, I will bid adieu to you, and I will see you next time.